What I'm about to tell you may seem a little bit weird. It might seem a little bit tetric, or maybe even a little negative, or perhaps even ugly. I don't know. But I think it's something that is important to discuss tonight. And it is a topic that nobody wants to talk about. And yet, whenever it comes up in the classes, and from time to time we talk about this at length, um, it turns out to be the most popular topic there is of all. So it is something that we all prefer to avoid or not discuss, and yet when it is discussed, people end up feeling a certain sense of tranquility or a certain sense of appeasement. And of course, this subject, again, it might seem a little negative, but I think it's important that we discuss this, is this whole idea of what we call death. So this is a tough subject, because we, especially in this class, is about personal development and growth and relationships and prosperity. There's this notion that somehow we should be dealing with what's here and now and so forth, and yet um oh, there you go. I didn't know the Mercury was retrograde, but you know thank you, Claudia. And I love when Claudia's around because she's our resident astrologer here, so she follows this stuff and always keeps us on track by keeping track of that's interesting. You see how the synchronicity works. Thank you for that. So apparently, it's a good subject for a night like tonight. But anyway, I wasn't. It doesn't come from consulting with the astrology. It came from the inspiration from within. But mystics say that there's only one truth, and no matter how you get to it, there are many ways of getting to the truth. But if something is true, it must be true no matter how you got there. So if something is true, whether you get to it through astrology, science, religion, philosophy, it doesn't matter. If it's true, it has to be true across the board. You have to lead to the same conclusion. All of those are just tools to lead us to the truth. And so there's only one truth. Christina asked, what does it mean when something is retrograde? And maybe we should have Claudia explain it. But the way I understand it is that if you think of all of the planets orbiting around the sun, they're all moving, in these semi-elliptical orbits. Of course, Mercury has a smaller orbit because it's closer to the sun, so it moves faster. The closer to the sun, the faster they move, and the smaller the orbit, right? And so, from the perspective of the Earth, from somebody sitting on the Earth, and all of these planets are moving in different directions and so forth. When you look at one given planet from the perspective of the Earth, sometimes it seems that this planet is moving away from us, and sometimes it looks like it's moving toward us. And what we call retrograde is when a planet, because of its orbital position, velocity, and direction, it is moving away from us. Uh, am I correct in this, Claudia? Is this what retrograde means? That the planet is moving away from us? Is that the right way of understanding it?
Yeah, no, you're perfect in your explanation. Astrologically, though, the retrograde just means that we kind of like review and revise and reflect and become really introspective with our thinking because it's Mercury retrograde. So every time we hear Mercury retrograde, it's just that we just kind of go back and we reflect on our thinking, on our ideas, on our thoughts, on our past plans, and we just sort of stay in this sort of uh form of just kind of like thinking of the past a lot. But I said that it was a good subject because it's happening in the sign of Scorpio, and Scorpio is astrologically traditionally known as the symbol of death. It just means it's the sign of transformation, and death is just another part in the whole scheme of life. It's just another transformation we go through.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that's fantastic, because of course there is a relationship between astrology and astronomy, right? In other words, the way I understand it is that in astrology we look at the effect that all of this stuff has on us, but the stuff that we're looking at is the actual astronomy. In other words, we look at the position of the planets and the stars and their relative movements and the constellations and so forth. So from an astronomical point of view, I think retrograde means that it's moving away from us. But then, of course, as you explained so eloquently, the effect that it tends to have on us is one of reflecting and looking back. It's almost as if we're separating from the experience, like in this case, the planet moving away from us, and so we look back. So there's this tendency to reflect, and that reflexive capacity is extraordinarily important. The Dalai Lama wrote a book several years ago called The Art of Happiness. And in that book, the Dalai Lama argues that in our culture here in the United States primarily, we have the idea that life is all about moving forward. It's all about development. It's all about prosperity. It's all about the next thing. It's all about going forward. To a certain extent, yeah, it's about living here and now and developing and growing. To a certain extent, that is healthy. But you got to remember that in absolute spiritual terms, there is no forward. In other words, if you always have your next goal, and let me paint the house, let me do this, let me do that, and you only do it that way, you only look forward, you got to realize that none of those goals really exist from a higher perspective. And so the person who only lives looking forward misses out on the opportunity to digest and assimilate. In the book, Awesome Again, I explain it in my own way a little differently. I make a comparison between the process of physical nourishment and emotional and spiritual nourishment. And I say that when you eat, right, if you look at the steps involved in eating, there are many steps. First, there's procurement. You have to go get the food. Then there's preparation. You got to prepare your food. Then you have to ingest it. Then you have to digest it, and then you have to assimilate, and then you have to eliminate residues. And it is only when you eliminate that the entire cycle is complete. And I claim in the book that our emotional and spiritual lives are the same way. We go seek out experiences, we prepare to live certain things, we live the thing, we end up separating what works from what doesn't work, and that's equivalent to digestion. And then you have to assimilate, separating to your being those lessons that you believe are good for you. And then you always have residues that you have to eliminate. No matter how perfect the experience seems to be to you, you got to let go of something. I remember working with a lady once, and she worked on her wedding for 2 years. She wanted to have the perfect wedding. And she says, my wedding is going to be perfect because this, because that. I know how to plan the wedding now. And I've been to plenty of weddings and I want to make this perfect. And she worked on it for 2 years. Everything was accounted for. And then I think the flowers were late or something happened like that, and she says, yeah, the wedding was pretty good, but there's the thing with the flowers. And the point I'm making is that even in the perfect experience, she still had to learn to let go of something. And that is analogous to elimination. There's some sort of residue that she wasn't happy with. She had to let go of that in order to assimilate the happy experience that she had just lived. And that is the same with life as a whole. So that process of digesting or separating what works for us from what does not work for us, and then assimilating some and eliminating other experiences, feelings, emotions, memories, the whole process is indeed a reflexive process. So we need to have that experience as well, because it is only during the reflective phase that we actually learn and grow. So you got to look back as well as forward, and continuously looking back and forward. And this is how we actually make faster progress through our spiritual development. So to a large extent, when we meditate, we go through these three phases. This is how we classically teach meditation, and I'll get to the depth in just a moment. But in meditation, we talk about the concentration of the mind, and then we talk about this regressive contemplation. You got to contemplate your life regressively. You got to ask yourself, where have I been? What have I done? You have to do that because without a reflexive component, we have a hard time developing further forward. And so, this idea of looking back is a great part of mystical knowledge. And it's interesting because we're just talking about astronomy and astrology, and astronomers are always doing what? I find this fascinating, but they keep on building bigger and better telescopes, and sometimes we put the telescope in outer space so that the images that they're looking at are not changed by the atmosphere of the Earth, right? So if you put the telescope outside of the atmosphere, then the clouds and stuff don't obscure the images you're looking at. So it would make sense, something like the Hubble telescope, where you put it in orbit so you don't have to deal with the atmospheric disturbances, right? But the further you look away with these very powerful telescopes, the further back you're also looking at, right? In other words, if I can look at a star that is 100 million light years away, what I'm looking at is the way the star looked 100 million years ago. And so we try to look further out so that we can see further back. And this is why they try to look at the very origin of the universe by looking further away. And it's fascinating how, to a large extent, the whole concept of astronomy has a lot to do with looking back into the past so that we can see the origin of the universe. So, anyway, just a little idea there for you to, and in therapy, we do the same thing, right? A person wants to become a better person, more effective. What do we do in therapy? We look past to their past. What was your origin like? What was your childhood? And you might think, well, isn't that boring? Isn't that like tedious? Is that really necessary? Well, it's the best way to, to this date, the concept of therapy, which keeps evolving, by the way, the therapy nowadays is nothing like it used to be 100 years ago. But to this date, therapy as an overall concept is the most effective way of moving forward the fastest. It's better than religion. In other words, as a way of changing you and making you more effective, therapy has shown to be more effective than other historical methods of creating change in your life. And a lot of it is based on looking back, which is quite interesting. So it's consistent with this mystical notion that by reflecting on the past, we become better capable of creating a better future. The model at in Orion Retreats, this new company that we have come up with, to help people through their retreat experiences. And why retreats? Because it is a way of condensing a ton of therapy in a few days as opposed to a few months, because it's very intense and the person is away from their day-to-day experiences. And so we can create a lot of change in fewer days, and we think that we can do about a month a day. In other words, about a month's worth of therapeutic benefit per day of retreat. And this, of course, is the data that I've been compiling for my 24 years in this field. And I've been to several retreats, and we get a lot done. Why? Because we're not dealing with everyday stuff, and because we have total focus from morning to night. So imagine, in 5 months of therapy, you can do a lot of progress. Well, 5 months of therapy would be a 5-day retreat. So that's absolutely fantastic. Anyway, our motto is heal your past, live your dreams, because history has proven over and over that a lot of our inability to move forward today has to do with our own past. Heal your past, live your dream. So the overall purpose is to live a better present and future. But the way we do that is by healing the past or healing the blocks, the unconscious blocks that would have otherwise made it difficult for us create a better future. So in therapy, we only look at the past to the extent that it's necessary in order to release our future. It's not that we keep on dwelling on the past. Anyway, the whole thing about retrograde right there. Going back to the idea of death, of taking advantage of, or in synchrony with the fact that we're in Scorpio now, as Claudia generously informed us. Thank you. Let's take a look at this from the perspective of Western mystical knowledge. Now, I fully acknowledge and understand and comprehend and accept and respect the fact that that is a very emotionally charged subject. And if you approach the subject from a religious perspective, from a cultural perspective, you may have vastly different ideas about it, and that's perfectly okay. The intention here is not to change it's just to share an idea, and hopefully it will be useful to you. The Jesus, right, has, and even if you're not a Christian, it doesn't matter. I'm not referring to Jesus as a religious entity, just as a person who said some really interesting things. But Jesus used to say that the truth sets you free. And oftentimes we suffer when another person dies. And in some cases, death can be quite tragic and difficult to understand. But I want to expand on the concept of death and discuss not only the death of the physical body as death, but I want to talk about death encompassing also the end of certain cycles of our lives. So, for instance, I would call a divorce, I would call that death. In other words, the marriage died, and that's what we call a divorce, as an example. To a large extent, when you graduate from college, your college years have died. Of course, we don't refer to it that way, but the phase of your life has died because a new phase is going to be born now. Now you're going to go get a job, right? So think of that, as simply the end of a phase, the end of a period, the end of a situation. And initially, when you look at it that way, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, I have been through many ends, many transitions, many substitutions of one phase for another. And in of itself, it's a good thing, because when one cycle ends, a new one begins. So it cannot be that bad. Here we are. And by the end of tonight's conversation, what I am hoping for is that you will make peace both with yourself and with perhaps a few deaths that you may have experienced in your life. And there are two things that tend to bother us human beings when it comes to death, in the more formal sense of the word, when someone else dies physically, right? One thing that bothers us quite a bit is the notion of injustice, a huge sense of injustice. In other words, not fair. So and so was so young. It wasn't fair the way he was killed or she was killed. In other words, we have problem with the mode of death, the age of the person. So and so was a good man. Why would he die? There's so many bad people who don't die. Of course, that's not true. Everybody dies eventually. But, and this idea of good and bad is an artificial invention of our minds. But in our minds, we do have a list, and we call some people good, some people bad. And then when those whom we label as good die, we think of it as an injustice. So when we suffer with death, at the root of it, there's always this notion that there's something unjust about that. Somehow the person shouldn't have died. A mistake has been made. So I'm going to tackle the notion of injustice. The other notion that I want to address, because from a clinical perspective, it's one of the things that causes a great deal of pain as well, in addition to the sense of injustice, is the way in which we deal with our own feelings toward the departed. You know, that person have prevented their own death, and in some way or another, if they had lived a different life, would they still be alive today? And on and on and on. So we have mixed feelings about the departed. I worked with a person once who had liver cancer. The daughter had liver cancer and died. I worked with the mom, and the daughter died of cancer in the liver. This is, the way the mom explained it to me. I never met the daughter. And she said that the daughter was sick, was ill with cancer, and they were going through treatment. And the doctor, but she was very healthy. She behaved healthy. She could walk, talk. Everything was normal, presumably. And the doctor told the mom, look, your daughter's dying, and so forth, and you have to make arrangements and so forth. So they used to go. The mom used to cry, telling me how they went casket shopping together, just like a mom-daughter. They go to the mall to buy clothes and stuff. They used to go shopping for caskets, and apparently this process went on for a while because they kept shopping for different kinds of caskets, in different funeral homes. Both mother and daughter for the daughter. And if you think about that whole experience, it seems a little eerie, right? But the mother kept recalling all of these events, and kept suffering, thinking that, at the root of it, the mother sort of blamed the daughter for having died of liver cancer. And it took a while to unravel that particular one, because I had no idea why the mother kept thinking that somehow the daughter had something to do with her own death to liver cancer. And it turns out that apparently the daughter had been born a son. And over the course of his life, I suppose, through the process of transitioning into the body of a female, took a whole lot of medications. And and I don't know if this is true or not, or what the mechanics of that really looks like, but apparently all of the medications affected the liver, and that had something to do with the cancer. And so the mother both missed the son, the daughter, and at the same time blamed her. You see, so blamed her for, and at the same time blamed herself for giving this daughter the wrong body. In other words, all of this blame that can get really, really, really complex. And this is what accounts for what they call complicated grief. We just cannot let go. We have this really, really complicated feelings toward what happened. We cannot make peace. So I'll give you an example. Losing a son is never easy, or son or a daughter. Losing a child is never an easy thing to do. But I'll give you an example. You have a son, and this is horrible, what I'm about to say, but the son grows up, gets into the army, goes to war, goes into a battle, and gets killed in battle. The army gives you a flag, a little medal, and say your son was a hero. He saved 3 of his buddies before he died. You put the flag in a little case, and you put a picture of your son on the wall. And I know that this is horrible, what I'm saying, but you look at the picture every day and you say, yeah, my son was a hero. He died for his country. And I'm not saying that that's easy, but there's a very clear explanation. They were taking this hill, the enemy ambushed them, shot at them from behind. Your son tried to save 2 of his men. He was able to save 3 of them, but then he got shot and he died. I'm sorry, ma'am, your son died, but he was a hero. And he died fighting for our country. We have a complete story. They ship the body home. You never see the body, but they ship a casket home. They give you the flag. And we have what we psychologically call closure. My son was in the army. He was in battle. They got ambushed by the enemy. He died. I got the flag and the medal. My son was a hero. See, we have closure. It's not easy to deal with the loss of the kid, but there's closure. I know what happened. Compare that to a man I worked with who was in the Air Force back in the 60s, stationed in Alaska. Now, this is at the height of the Cold War. The Russians, the Soviets are about to throw nuclear bombs on us, and everybody's on high alert. And they have this Air Force station in northern Alaska, because that's the closest point to the Soviet Union. And these guys are out on patrol one night, and this one man inside of an Air Force base in Alaska disappears inside of the base. To this very date, the official story is that they never recovered the body. They don't know what happened to the man inside of a base. This is the official story. I worked with the son, and the son says, I don't know what happened to my dad. They don't know if he got abducted by aliens. They don't know if the Soviets got him. They don't know if it was an accident. They don't know if his buddies shot him and buried him in the snow. They don't know if the father was a spy and went back to. They have no idea what happened. Not even a flag. There's no body. There's no closure. Do you see what I'm saying? There's no closure. So we humans seek closure. Why did they? We crave the understanding. We crave closure. And what we mean by closure is understanding. But why this? But why that? But why this? But why that? To a large extent, that's why we do autopsies. To a large extent. I know there are other reasons, legal reasons, for criminal reasons, whatever. So we do an autopsy to see if there's any foul play. But much of the reasons why we in our society perform autopsies is for closure. Oh, I get it. It was heart disease. Oh, so now there's closure. Now I understand what happened. You see? So we need closure. Well, I'm here to tell you that in some cases, there will be no closure from a physical point of view. You can investigate the facts, like this man's father that I just told you about. He was inside of a base. He disappeared. There's nobody, and nobody's talking. And this was back in the early 60s. The man grew up investigating this mystery. To this day, to the last I spoke with him some 7 years ago, there's just no story. Nobody talks. Somebody must know what happened to this guy, but nobody knows. Nobody's talking. So from a physical perspective, sometimes there's no closure. When that happens, and again, when I talk about that, I want to expand on the notion of death to other issues in life as well. The death of a relationship, the death of a situation, the death of a job, the death of an interaction with a group. Sometimes it just dies and you have no idea why. When that happens, when there is no closure from a physical perspective, I want to encourage you to seek a different kind of closure. And that is to find spiritual closure. And what those experiences help us do is this. In other words, when you get physical closure, you get a story that appeases you. My son was in the army, the enemy ambushed him, and you got closure. That way you got the flag and the medal, plus the picture on the wall. That's it, closure, right? It doesn't make death any easier, but there's closure. When that happens, okay, good. I got it. I got what I needed. When it doesn't happen, when there is no explanation, then the only thing you can do is to reach and tap into your spiritual knowledge and ask yourself the following. Does it matter the circumstances of this person's death or the situation's death? Does it really matter? And what I mean by that is the following. Pretend you are a playwright. A playwright is somebody who writes stories for the theater, for the movies, right? A playwright. So you're like the author of the story. So you're writing a soap opera, a novella, right? And this particular soap opera requires 15 actors and actresses. So it's expensive. You have to pay 15 salaries of all these actors and actresses because one is the mom, one is the son, one is the priest, one is the thief, the other guy is the boyfriend, so you need 15 actors to represent the soap opera. I'm making up these numbers. I'm just giving you an idea, right? So when you add the camera crews and the makeup artists and the wardrobe people, when you are going to produce the soap opera, it's very expensive. You have to pay a lot of people. But you think, okay, I'm going to make some money in the form of advertisement. Well, the business didn't go as you expected. You're losing money, and you're the producer of the soap opera. So you say, dude, I got to cut out 5 employees here. I got to cut out 5 people. But remember, you're the one writing the story. Well, you can't just say they didn't show up the next day to work. What happened to the husband of the girlfriend of the boyfriend? Like what happened to the story? The soap opera won't work if these people just don't show up the next day. So what would you do in the context of the soap opera? Those characters would have to what? They would have to die somehow, isn't that so? So in the soap opera, you have to take them out. Maybe the 5 of them were driving in a car and the car fell down the cliff and all 5 of them died. So in the soap opera, you create a story. They were going to this town in the mountain and there was snow on the road. They didn't see the truck coming in. There was an accident. All 5 of them died. So in the story, you have a justification for taking all 5 of them out at the same time. And now you save yourself 5 salaries. And the soap opera continues with 10 actors only as opposed to 15. Do you see the point I'm making here? Now, if you are the playwright, if you're the author of this story, does it really matter much whether you create an accident in the mountain versus an explosion at the house versus a thief that fired a machine gun and killed all 5? Does it really matter how these people die in this story? So long as the story can make some degree of sense, as far as the soap opera is concerned, the point was to take him out because you needed to save on the budget. So the cosmic, what we call the cosmic, God intelligence work on the earth, recognizes that our life on this earth is like a school, is like a lesson, is like a period that we have to spend here learning a few lessons. And we don't really know what the lesson is. We don't, none of us do. We're all in this together. Like we don't really know exactly what we're doing here. We're just kind of experiencing this and trying to figure out after the fact what the lesson was. It's like, imagine that I told you this. Imagine I tell you, listen, go over there to the mall, go to the mall, look around, and come back over here. And you say, okay, I can do that. I can go to the mall, I can look around, and I can come back. But what do you want me to pay attention to? What do you want me to look for? Do you want me to look for suspicious activity? Do you want me to look for new fashion? Do you want me to look for undercover police officers at the mall? What do you want me to look out for? I said, no, don't worry about it. Just go to the mall and come back over here and tell me what you thought. But you have no idea what you're looking for. You just go to the mall and you come back. When you come back, I tell you, okay, what did you learn? What did you experience at the mall? And you tell me, wow, I saw a lot of people holding hands. I saw people not wearing a mask. I saw people buying clothes. And I say, no. None of this was the point. I asked you to go to the mall so you could enjoy ice cream. Did you enjoy ice cream? Say, no, man, I was busy observing. I thought I had to, you see the point I'm making? We don't know what we're here to do. We think we do, but we don't. We are only going to know what the whole thing was after we're done with the experience. We don't have a whole picture as to what we're doing here, but we do trust that there's such a thing as cosmic intelligence, which alerts us to the fact that whatever it is that we're doing here has been done already. And then it really doesn't matter how we leave this setting. In other words, whether it's an accident, an illness, a shooting, or whatever else, or we got swallowed up by the earth, the point is that we had to leave. So when it might, the way I'm explaining this may not make too much sense to you right now, but you're going to see that we have this profound need for closure. And if you can get closure by studying the details of what happened, great, I'm happy for you. If you cannot get closure by studying the details of what happened, I'd like to suggest that you study a different set of details. Study the fact that we are all two things simultaneously. There's the equivalent of an actor, which is immortal, and there's the equivalent of a character in a movie. So this thing that you and I call I, have you ever asked yourself what that is? I am so and so. We use the word I. What is that I? So by I mean, well, it's an individual. It is something different and separate from you. I have an individuality, a personality. I have a name, right? All of those things. I have a body. All of those things is what I call the I. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought about the fact that that I does not exist? It's like a character in a story. In other words, if I write a soap opera here, I wrote a novel called Finding TH. And the novel is autobiographical, of course. It's a story of a man who was seeking the mystical path and eventually had a horrible thing happening in his life. And then he goes out seeking answers and so forth. So the whole story is true, is perfectly accurate, but it's a novel because there are a few characters that were added in there because I couldn't represent, the mystical portion of the thing, is represented by characters in the story. So those characters in the story are real in the story. Just like the I, you, and I are real in this story of life. But remember, the character is only real in the story. They don't really exist. You and I don't exist as such, the way that we think that we do. We exist, but not as individuals, not as fragments of life, the way that we think of ourselves. And so this fragment of life periodically need to be reabsorbed into the whole, just like if you took out some water from the ocean in a cup and you came to play with the water in the sand at the beach, and then eventually you pour the water back into the sand of the beach, where does that water end up eventually? It soaks up into the sand of the beach and eventually finds its way back to the ocean. You see, so the ocean contains all this water. I took out a whole bucket of it, I brought it to the beach, I played with it, and then I poured it right back into the beach. It soaked up into the sand and ended up right back into the ocean. So that amount of water that was in this bucket initially was indistinguishable from the rest of the ocean. It was just the ocean. The moment that I scooped it up into this bucket, the volume of water became individualized, right? Became an I, became individual, became separated from the ocean. But the destiny of that volume of water is to go back to the ocean. And you say, oh no, but I poured it here on the beach. I know, you poured it here on the beach. Don't worry about it. It's going to sip right back through the sand all the way back to the ocean. And those molecules of the water eventually not find them anymore. They're all over the ocean. They get all mixed up with the ocean again. You can no longer separate that particular chunk of water once they got back into the ocean. And so the notion that this volume of water over here in the bucket is intrinsically different and separate from the water that's over there in the ocean, that notion is very temporary and very artificial. Because the moment that I let this bucket go, even if I'm here at the beach, it's going to be reabsorbed into the volume of water of the ocean. It becomes one again. And that bucket of water that only has a temporary separate existence inside of my bucket. The volume of water, which is really a part of the ocean, but I temporarily separated it from the ocean. The volume of water is like you and I. We are part of the ocean, we're a part of the cosmic, we're a part of it all. But we adopt this temporary notion that we're inside of this bucket called the body. And because we're here in this body, and my body looks a little different from yours, and plus I refer to it with a different name and with different sets of experiences and so forth, we actually begin to think that we exist as a separate entity. We actually adopted that belief. It's only a habit of the mind, that the mind adopts that belief. And the belief serves as a purpose within the context of this theatrical soap opera that we call life. But it isn't real. And all of our pain and suffering comes from the insistence in the reality of the illusion. In other words, we take something that is entirely an illusion, and we attribute ultimate reality to it, and then we suffer. The moment you realize that there's really no reality to the illusion, because it is just an illusion, it can actually be a lot of fun. Now, is that the same thing as not caring? Look, I've told you this in other classes, and I honestly believe that of all the movies I have ever seen in my life, and I've seen quite a few movies, and each movie has many scenes, right? You know how a movie is shot. I studied theater once, and you make a movie, you have an idea for the story, but then you record scene by scene, right? Each scene has a number so that you can keep track and assemble the whole movie. So the most impressive scene I have ever seen at the movies, of all the movies I've ever seen, was one scene in a movie called A Beautiful Mind. Has anybody here seen the movie called A Beautiful Mind? The man had schizophrenia.
Yes.
It was, I think it was a story of John Nash. The guy was a Nobel Prize. You saw the movie? Who's talking?
Irina, I had seen it.
So that movie was impressive for various reasons. I thought it was a good.
Russell Crowe. Right.
Exactly, yes, correct. That movie was quite impressive for various reasons, right? And remember that nowadays they have good medications that can help a person with that kind of illness. And a person like him today could live a reasonably normal life nowadays. But back then they didn't have medications, or not effective ones at least. I think Thorazine was the first one, and it came out like in 1952 or something. So the time when the movie took place is just about the time when the very first types of medicines are coming out, but they're very, very difficult to manage. Anyway, so the point is this. In that movie, they tell the story of a man who develops this disease called schizophrenia, which is a very difficult disease. Essentially, the man goes, as we call popularly, crazy, and is seeing things, imagining things. He's going crazy, right? So voices are talking to him. He's seeing things, and eventually he begins to believe these images and these voices. And there's a scene in the movie in which he believes that his wife is really trying to kill him. So he attacks her. Of course, we can't really fault him. It's not, whatever. It's a very difficult situation. The man has a mental illness, but he's trying to defend himself, and he attacks his wife. Anyway, they stop the situation, whatever. But then they all realize now that this situation is getting really dangerous. They cannot live together anymore, because at any moment he could have killed the wife, right? So they have the mother pick up the daughter, and they take the daughter away, and then the wife is leaving because she has to save her life, So now they're having this conversation right before she leaves him. And he's sitting on the edge of the bed, I saw the movie when it first came out, and I'll never forget this scene. And she's kind of kneeling on the floor between his legs, and they're talking. And they're having the very first conversation about the reality of this mental illness. You know, I don't think up until then in the movie she realized just how ill this man was. And he says, "Yeah, I see things and I hear voices." It's basically telling her what this illness is all about. Up until then, I don't think they had talked about this. And then he says to her, "The problem is that I no longer know what is real." Because we all imagine things, we all see things, but we can distinguish imagination from reality. Or hopefully we can. And he says the problem with this illness, the problem with what's happening to me, he says, is that I can no longer differentiate between what's real and what's not real. And that's a huge, think about that for a second. That's a huge problem. So in the movie, the wife tenderly puts her hand on his face in a very loving way. The scene is so beautifully shot. The angle of the camera, the lighting, I mean, it's perfect, perfect cinematography. And she looks at him with her head, tilted to the side and says, "This is real." And I'm telling you this story to make a point here, that I tell you that this entire theater that we call life is unreal. But that doesn't mean that everything is unreal. Some things are real. So the most striking thing that is real, and that is something that I would suggest you guard very carefully, and that is your heart, because that is real. So what is done to you is unreal. It doesn't matter. What happens at the end of the day doesn't really matter that much. It's unreal. We all have to check out, and we cannot take anything with us anyway, and none of that is real. None of that matters. But your heart is real, and what is in there is real. And so if somebody steals something from you, as an example, whatever they stole wasn't real, and it doesn't matter whether you have it or not. I remember one time somebody stole just about everything I had. It was a really odd thing. And at first I was a little ticked off, and then I realized that the person did me a huge favor, because I didn't have to deal with anything. It was almost like starting over with nothing to carry, nothing to deal with, So it was almost like a favor, And so the point here is this: if somebody steals something from you, that act has no meaning. The consequence of not having that item has no meaning. It's unreal. But if you resent the person who stole it from you, that is real. It's weird, And you go, how can my feeling toward that person be real if the act is unreal? Think about that for a second. And this is why, I'm not making all this stuff up. I'm telling you this because I've been studying this my whole life. In ancient Egypt, there is a papyrus. I have it at the house. It's beautiful. That depicts a scene called the judgment scene. And in this judgment scene, the dead person was taken to a particular place in front of a god, and the 12 gods of judgment were there. And the person's heart was removed from his body. Of course, this is all symbolic, right? And the heart was placed on a balance. And on the other plate of the balance, a feather was placed. So imagine a human heart on one side of the balance, weighed against the weight of a feather. And the idea is that your heart has to be lighter than a feather. And if it isn't, if your heart is heavy, you go into the underworld. This would be equivalent to what Christians later called purgatory. You go into the underworld. But if you want to go to the upper world, what in Christianity would be called heaven, your heart has to be lighter than a feather. Now, all of this is symbolic, of course. A heart that is lighter than a feather simply means that you're free of resentment. So notice that they did not weigh what happened to you or who did what to you, because none of it is real. But they did weigh your heart, if your heart was heavy. So all of these depictions, all of this papyri, all of this knowledge that has been handed down from generation to generation for thousands of years has evolved because over millennia, people have observed that it is true. What happens to you is unreal and it doesn't matter. And yet, how you feel about it is true and it does matter. Now, that's really odd. How you feel is real, what happened is unreal. Think about that for a moment. It took me years to understand this. It took me years to really, really, really understand this. And obviously, I still don't understand all of it, but I'm sharing with you what I have understood so far. And so, what I'd like to suggest you right now is do a little quick mental inventory of your own life. Mental, right now, real quick. And I'm sure that if I were to ask you each individually, which we're not going to do now for several reasons, but if I were to ask you individually, each one of you, obviously, can tell me about a few facts of your life that you don't quite like. I can tell you about some bad things that have happened, and so can you. All of us can. All of that stuff that you could tell me, I'd like for you to imagine that it's part of, you know what a hologram is? Like a picture in 3 dimensions. Have you ever seen a hologram? Imagine a hologram. In other words, it has depth. It's like the image on a screen at the movie theater, but this is 3-dimensional, and you can walk around it. But if you put your hand through it, there's nothing there. It's just light, like a hologram. So imagine that you walk into a room, and there's this hologram with all of these people and all of these situations that represent all of the stuff that you don't like that happened in your life. Maybe it's a person who's abusive. Maybe it's this. Maybe it's that. Maybe when you're 5 years old, somebody stole your pencil. Or maybe it is that they, whatever, right? All of these scenes that you have in your memory of stuff that, and by the way, I'm not saying that this stuff is good or right. I'm not saying that, I'm sure that many of those things are injustices or bad things. I get that from a human perspective. But look, I'd like for you to imagine all of the stuff that happened in your life happening inside of a room. But what you're looking at is a huge hologram, and all of the characters are there, you are there. It's a hologram. It has colors, it has sounds. But then, right here on your left, there's a big switch on the wall, big, huge switch. Right now, it's in the on position, so you keep looking, and all of the stuff is happening. This person is doing this to that person is doing this to this person, that person is screaming at this person. Look at all the tragedy in your life, whatever. And suddenly, on your left over here on the wall, you reach for that switch and you flip it to the off position and you turn off the hologram. None of the stuff that used to bother you even exists. You just turned off the hologram. It no longer exists. It no longer matters. It doesn't matter who did what to whom, who did this, who. And by the way, you're a part of the hologram. What you did wrong that you feel guilty for or ashamed about doesn't exist either. You just turned it off. So now you turn around and you look toward your right, and it surprises you because there's a mirror, floor to ceiling mirror, and you see yourself on the mirror, and you go, oh wow, that stuff I was just watching right there isn't real, or just turned it off and it's no longer happening. But as I turn around and I look, I see a mirror, I see me. That's real. And so now I want you to imagine, just like in the movies, that the mirror is magical. Remember in, I think it's Snow White or one of those, the woman talks to the mirror. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? You remember that story? I'd like for you to imagine that the stuff is real for just a moment. And that the mirror on the wall is magical. But rather than telling you who's the prettiest or whatever, no, this mirror, by virtue of being magical, allows you to see inside of you. And I don't mean inside of your physical body, I mean inside of your being. You can see your own heart. And I don't mean your physical heart, I mean your metaphorical heart, your emotional heart. And I'd like for you to take a really good look at it. Focus on you and your heart and your feelings. And how are you really doing there? See, this particular exercise is 100% between you and God. Nobody else can get in that conversation. Nobody can. Nobody can judge you. Nobody knows what's in there. Only you. You don't have to tell anybody. But take a really good look at it. You're going to see many great things in there, obviously. But if you find anything in there, such as sadness, a feeling of injustice, a feeling of resentment, a feeling of hatred, there's no judgment. Nobody's judging you. Whatever you find in there, that is no longer useful for you. Because, my dear friends, quit kidding around. Everything inside of us that is there now is there because it serves a purpose. If a person hates someone, that hatred is serving a purpose. I've been dealing with this for 24 years in therapy. Everything serves a purpose. When something ceases to be useful, we let go of it. Feelings, projection of guilt, feelings serve a purpose as well. And so, when you look inside of your heart, you're going to see lots of light and lots of love and lots of great things. I know it. But you might see a little spot of sadness, or a little spot of feeling of injustice, or a little spot of resentment towards somebody, that kind of thing, right? You might not, but you might feel that some of the stuff is in there. I'd like for you to look at those spots. Don't be afraid. Don't be shy. Look at those spots carefully. Listen, I'll give you a little parenthetical, biblical piece of awareness here. The Bible says that when God creates, God stops to look at the creation and claim that it's good. So, for instance, in Genesis, it says that God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. Notice, there are three phases to the process. God said, "Let there be light." That's one. Two, and there was light. And then three, and God saw the light was good. That three, and that's why mystics represent everything with the law of triangles. Everything is a triangle. let there be light, there is light. Light is good. Oftentimes, we skip the last step. We create, but we forget to stop, look at it, and claim that it's good. Well, the same triangle works in any direction you want. You can look at your heart and say, that resentment is no longer useful to me. And you can watch as the resentment is dissolved. Notice the three phases of the process. You look at it, you see it, you say, this is now being dissolved, and then you see it gone. You see that it's good that it's no longer there. And so the situations that happened in your life, we can talk about this all night. Was it fair? Was it just? Was it good? Was it bad? Are you right? Are you wrong? Are you guilty? Are you innocent? And to be honest, that conversation will not take us anywhere. I can tell you my stories, you tell me your stories. They might be really interesting stories. And from a social point of view, we all need to tell stories and we need to be heard and understood. And we bond over our tragedies as well. If I tell you some really bad stories that happened to me, then you tell me some really bad stories about you, we bond, particularly if our tragedies are similar. There's a human tendency to bond over negatives. That's okay. But nothing is solved. So it's okay if you want to use your stories to bond with another person. That's all right. But nothing has been solved. And so eventually we turn off the whole program and re-emphasize the events. It just doesn't matter because none of it is real to begin with. And then you realize, oh, I get it. The whole reason why that event had to happen was to give me an opportunity to find out what's in my heart. That's the only thing that matters. That's the only thing that's real. So you look at your heart. What are the feelings that are in there? Only you will know. Only you can know. Pay attention to your heart. You might find a feeling of sadness. You might find a feeling of resentment, whatever. Those things, right? And as you do, begin to decree, begin to declare. Like Joel Osteen says, I declare it. And say, you know what? I am freeing myself from this. I'm letting this go. I am healing. And then sit there in perfect silence for a moment, in profound introspection, and observe your heart and ask yourself, is my heart free of that feeling or thought or idea? And sit there for a moment until you can be sure that your heart is free. Because that is real. Remember the story about the Egyptians removing the heart from the defunct's body and weighing it against a feather? And that is how our lives are judged, according to the weight of our hearts. Metaphorical, yes, Ancient, yes. True nonetheless. That's the only thing that matters. My friends, has it ever occurred to you how many people have been through this earth? Regardless of this idea of reincarnation or not, regardless of how many unique souls have incarnated on this earth, because a lot of the people who were born are actually the same ones coming back over and over. But regardless, how many unique souls have incarnated on this earth over the years? Ever since the very first incarnation of somebody that we could call human, a modern human. How many people? I don't know, billions, obviously. Maybe trillions, I have no idea. Each one of those people, and most of them are dead, right? In other words, more people have already died than are alive today. Today, what, 7 billion people are alive? I think more than 7 billion people have already died since the first day on the earth, right? True? So when you look to all those, let's pretend it's 20 billion people. I have no idea. Let's just pretend, right? You look at those 20 billion people who already died. Each one of them has a story. They were born, they had hopes, dreams. Maybe they got sick, maybe not. Maybe they got married, maybe not. Maybe they had kids, maybe not. But they have a story there. And what happened to all of them? They all died. And what remains? What's real? You see, we don't even know who they are. We don't remember them. We remember a few people in history. Just a few. Most of them, we have no awareness of what happened. They were born, they lived, and they died. And the point I'm making is that if those lives were that important, why would there be no record, no understanding, no memory of it? Well, our lives are just as unimportant in the great scheme of things. But there's one thing that is important, and that is who you are. Your true thoughts, your true intentions, your true actions, what's really in your heart. That is important. What you do when nobody is watching, that is important. What you do when everybody's watching is not important. I know it's weird, right? But what you do when nobody's watching, that's what really measures who are. When there's no way to get anything in return, when there's no way to get any merit or credit, what you do when nobody's looking, all of that stuff is real. Everything else is not real. And so, when you look into this magical mirror, there's a huge temptation to look at the event. Yeah, but look what happened here. Yeah, but look what happened there. It's unimportant. Going back to the idea of death, when you and I are gone from this physical experience, the one thing you will take with you, as I will, is whatever's in your heart today. But who did what to whom will be forgotten quite quickly. Most of it is already forgotten, and you're still here. So my suggestion is, starting today, let's take a deep and honest look at our hearts. And let's begin to clean it up. Let's begin the process. Let's start with the intention of forgiving everyone, including ourselves. Just intention. It might not be easy to forgive everyone, but we start with the intention to forgive. We hypnotists, we have this idea, we do something called a hypnotic induction. That's the process of taking somebody into the hypnotic state. And so we use suggestions to do that. And one of the types of suggestions that we use is this thing that we call induced amnesia. And we essentially ask a person to forget something, and then we ask them to name that thing. And if they actually accepted the suggestion, they won't be able to name it because we told them to forget it. And one way to make that particular suggestion more acceptable to the mind is to say to the person, start with the idea that you want this to happen, and it will happen. Pay attention to that construct that only the master hypnotists would use. You offer a subject. This is how we talk, right? We offer the subject a really odd suggestion that under normal circumstances the mind would not accept. But then we say it to the person in a way that they can accept it. We say, well, start with the idea that you want this to happen, and it will happen. Well, I've been hypnotizing people for 24 years. It works. So tonight, I'd like to suggest something to you, if you allow me. Start with the idea that you want to forgive everyone for everything, and you will forgive everyone for everything. Excuse me, it's freezing here. Start with the idea that you want this to happen, and it will happen. Does anyone want to say anything? Does anyone have any questions or comments? Oh, Christina saw the movie. Did you like the movie, Christina?
Yeah, I love the movie. That was a great movie.
What year? Do you remember what year? Not the year that the movie came out, but the year that was represented in the movie. I believe it was the early 50s, if I'm not mistaken, right? Is that true?
I don't know. I don't remember. But I know I like the movie because I saw it from the medical perspective. I saw it actually like 3 times. One for my psych class for psychiatry, and 2 more that they was on HBO or whatever.
Yeah, but right, from a medical perspective, I remember it must have been the early 50s because there was no medication. I remember that in the movie they used electroconvulsive therapy without the muscle relaxants, I mean, in the way that they represent this in the movies, and the person shaking in the bed, as they apply current to the brain, which is horrific, But there was really no medication. So imagine for most of humanity, this illness has existed throughout human history. And it wasn't until really the 1960s that the first effective medications, I think 52 was when the first one came out, but really, this stuff wasn't really generally available until like the early 60s. And imagine, the early 60s was just the other day, and for most of humanity, people would develop this illness, and there was absolutely no hope for them. In fact, they used to have these, what did they used to call them? These places where they would house them. They were essentially dungeons, and they would be tortured because
Asylums.
yeah,
Asylums.
the asylums, because the asylum movement, they would be housed in these asylums, and, and there was a punishment involved because in the Middle Ages, mental illness was seen as the work of the devil. Imagine where humanity came from. And so you must have committed a sin, and it must have been really bad for having this mental illness. That was the thinking at the time, I'm saying. It's not the thinking today. I'm talking about years ago. And so mental patients
So I'm
were
reading here
tortured.
I'm reading here in his biography, and says that his early signs were in 1959.
59.
And until the 70s, where he was able to improve his condition with medication, and in the 80s he starts getting much better.
Yeah.
The guy died not too long ago.
Yeah. Nowadays I've seen patients. It's interesting because nowadays they can live a relatively normal life with that illness because the medications have become so much more sophisticated, and they use sometimes a combination of medications, and people can live much better lives, and the families are so much better off. So but yeah, just a few years ago this was a huge problem because there's no way to manage this other than to essentially incarcerate the person in an asylum and let them die there, because you couldn't really manage this, and it was horrible, absolutely horrible.
One of the things that I liked about the movie, one of the lines that he said, I think when they asked him about still seeing those images, the reality, and he says that they're still there, but he just doesn't feed it. He chooses not to feed that anymore.
Yeah. I remember that line. Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah. Because by then, because in a sense, at that point, he's already quote unquote cured of the illness. I'll tell you why I say this. Because the real problem with the illness is what he told his wife earlier, which is the inability to distinguish reality from illusion. That's the real problem here. Because if I see a ghost on the wall, but I know it's a ghost, no problem. It's just an image on the wall. It's just a ghost on the wall. It's not a big deal. I turn on the light and I go, it doesn't really matter, right? The problem is if I see a ghost here or an image here and I don't know that it's unreal. Imagine. So by the time that he began to differentiate these things and not pay too much attention to the images and the voices, in a sense, he can already recognize the reality of those images and voices and sounds and impressions. There's a scene later on when he's in college, he's back teaching, and somebody comes to talk to him, and he asks the student, "Can you see this guy?" And the student laughs and says, "Yeah, I can see him." So, okay, he's real. I can talk to him then. He begins to make a joke about it. And at that point, it's almost as if he's already overcome the problem because he can already begin to differentiate those two worlds. The problem is when you cannot differentiate. Christine and I were driving in downtown Miami on Sunday. We went to have breakfast there, and we saw a person who lived on the street screaming at himself or with himself. But and we had to stop at a red light, and we were observing him for a minute or so. And he wasn't just randomly screaming. He was actually talking to somebody, except that there's nobody there. And she asked me, says, "Well, who is he talking to?" I said, "Well, the thing is that they see entities. They see things and people, entities, and they have entire conversations and entire arguments and fights, and they actually engage, and they have a serious problem with what this person is saying or doing, and they engage. And what happens to them? They end up living on the street." Now you might say, "Oh, I get it. That's because the guy is homeless. That's because he has a mental illness." Well, what's really weird about this story is that, in a sense, what we're seeing there in that man screaming at those entities in the middle of the street, what we're seeing there is an extreme version of all of ourselves. Think about it. we also pay way too much attention to irrelevant things. And in so doing, we end up dissipating a whole lot of energy, don't we? Think about that for a second. In other words, we think we are normal, and we think that we're great, and we think that we only pay attention to what's real and important. We think that about ourselves. But look at our lives very carefully and ask yourself, how much energy do we really dissipate and waste focusing on things that are unreal? And see someone else observing us from a distance, right? And then they realize, oh my gosh, to a certain extent, we're not all that different from the homeless guy arguing with an entity that nobody else can see. To him, that entity is real, and he has a real stake in this fight. He needs to win this argument because it matters. It's really important. Now, you're observing it from the car, and you're saying, dude, there's nobody there. Don't worry. Just go get a job, clean up, take a shower, you know? But he can't go home and take a shower and clean up, and because he needs to win this argument. This is important to him, except that there's nobody there. Now you might think, oh no, I'm not like that. Well, not quite like that, not to that extreme, not to that extent, but we all waste a little bit of energy arguing with things that are not there, you know. I love what you said, Andrea. You know, it's like it's all about, you know, focusing on what's important and separating it from what really doesn't matter and not focusing on that, because to allow all this energy to escape and be dissipated that way is a real tragedy, a real loss. Anyone else want to say anything or ask anything?
Yeah, I want to say something, Serena. What if there is an entity there and I do see it and we just cannot see that? So is that possible?
Yes, yes, of course. There's something there, right? Because even if it's only in his mind, it's real to him. There's an entity there for real, right? That's what I'm saying. So this is what we call a metaphysical question by definition. In other words, beyond the physical. The classical question in metaphysics is, what is real? What is reality? And this is why we say the first law of metaphysics is nothing unreal exists, because there would be a logical contradiction. If it exists, it is real. So nothing unreal can possibly exist. And so what is real is what you give existence to. So if this person is arguing with an entity that he's imagining, well, that imagination turns into reality by virtue of the fact that he's imagining it. So to him it's real, therefore it exists. I know that it may sound like a convoluted explanation, but there's a reality there. So
question.
What?
Question, sorry.
Yeah.
True that there's a theory that some of these people with schizophrenia, they have what they call an unhealthy opening of the third eye, and they could actually see, entities in the astral, what they call astral plane, and not exactly of the, light caliber, and that's why they're always fighting with these entities. Is that one of the theories, right?
Yes. Mental illness is one of the, great frontiers of medicine for the 21st and 22nd centuries, because mental health is as primitive today as physical medicine was about 150 years ago. In other words, if you look at physical medicine 100 years ago or so, they knew nothing. I mean, there's no x-ray, there was nothing, no medicine, no antibiotics, nothing. So medicine 100 some years ago was very primitive as compared to today's medicine, right? Well, mental medicine is like going back to the Stone Ages of it's like we don't know anything. Like, we keep on treating people with a few medications, whatever, but we really don't know. So we mystics would say that, the third eye is this organ that gives you the ability to see beyond the physical dimension. And we think that we can develop that skill by doing certain exercises and so forth, you know. But one thing that we do know, I remember years ago, I had I had a student in the class, in my class, not in a, our teacher was still with us physically, but I was doing a class at school, and there was this one man, I remember him really well, who refused to participate and refused to contribute anything to the class. At that time, I never charged anything. You know, it was all for the school, of course. But he would come in and not contribute. He would refuse to contribute. You know, and it didn't bother me one way or the other. It didn't affect me one way or the other. But I thought there was something really odd about his refusal to participate and his refusal to contribute. So one day, even though it didn't matter to me physically or materially, I asked him if he would kindly contribute. You know, I think they had asked him for like $5 at the door or whatever, no, but he refused to pay. So he told me, nope, I don't want to contribute because I cannot afford to. I don't want to, whatever, no. But he was so there was something about his attitude that I thought was really odd. You know, he was too sure of the fact that he didn't have to contribute. You know, it was just odd. It was an odd attitude. You know? So after 2 or 3 weeks of that, I told him that I preferred if he didn't come back to my class. I did that. I told him that. So anyway, if I end the story here, you might think, oh my gosh, Flavio, how mean could you possibly be? How could you do that? You know, this poor guy didn't have $5 and you refused to let him into the class. Well, it wasn't really my business or anything. It didn't really matter to me. But there's something odd about him, right? Well, the story does not end there. The guy disappeared. Nobody ever saw him again. He was gone. One day, we're all in class, and guess who shows up at the door? The cops. True story. And the cops want to know what it is that we're doing there because he's hospitalized. And, you know, I'll make a long story short. In addition to coming to my class, he was going to someone else's class, not at our school, because this has never happened at our school. He was going to some other school. I have no idea where, but I found out all of this through a mutual friend of ours who followed the case very closely. Furthermore, this man, the one who refused to pay, recovered from what I'm about to tell you and eventually told me the story. So he was going to this other school in which they promised him that if he would take some substances, he could open his third eye more speedily, faster. So this man started using substances, aka drugs, to speed up his psychic development. And he fried his brain. He went bananas and started screaming at the wall. So they had to hospitalize him. So then one day he told me, no, they gave me drugs at school, and they thought they meant our school, which of course we never did. Nobody there ever used any, you know, we don't do that. We do it differently. You know, it was somewhere else. But the cops showed up and asked us, well, what kind of drugs are you guys dispensing here? It's not here. You can look anywhere you want. You know, they understood and they left. I mean, there's nothing there, obviously. You know, but the point I'm making is that you know, there's something odd about the person. You know, and this is what he was doing. He was going somewhere else, taking drugs to open. And the use of substances to speed up psychic development is extraordinarily dangerous, because what you tend to do is open up the third eye, but in a sense connect with the so-called underworld, and you end up seeing images. Oh yes, but you end up seeing horrible images. I don't think I've been around this path for pretty much most of my life. I don't think, except for once that I can recall right now, there was a time in my life when I was doing a whole lot of exorcism. I've done over 300 exorcisms. And there was one time that, for whatever reason, I was doing this all the time, a ton of it. And once, Once I woke up and there was an entity that, there was an entity there, and I asked this entity to leave, and it was a little uncomfortable. It was a little uncomfortable. Once in all of these years, there was one image that was uncomfortable. Once. And yet, I've had beautiful experiences of peace, of love, beautiful experiences. And yet the people that I know that use drugs, they tell me that they open up their third eyes and it's magical and it's this and it's that. And I ask them, and they have a whole bunch of disturbing experiences. So my teacher, and I say mine, I don't mean to be indelicate, he was also the teacher of thousands of other people, obviously. But my teacher, and I think it's normal to refer to your teacher like that, my teacher, but my teacher taught us that using any kind of substance is unnecessary. You can do a very gradual development of your third eye and you can see beautiful images, as opposed to trying to speed up the process and end up seeing disturbing images. So it's possible that one of the things that happens in this type of mental illness is that people consume substances. It's possible. That damages the whole apparatus there, and they end up opening the third eye, and it just kind of damages the whole thing. It's possible. So they end up seeing disturbing images, So it is still a mystery. I don't think we have the final word on this illness. I read up on this illness. There's a whole track in the APA, the American Psychiatric Association. There's a whole track of psychiatrists and scientists that study that kind of mental illness, and I'm on their email list, and I get emails from them almost every day, and new journal articles come out, and I glance over them from time to time, and the bottom line is nobody knows. That's the bottom line. Nobody really knows. But they do have really interesting medications nowadays that for the most part allow the person to live a relatively normal life, which is a huge plus, which is a huge positive, because in the old days, nothing, just torture and restraining. So nowadays they can help the person live a relatively okay life, which is awesome. But we're still babies when it comes to mental health. We don't know exactly how to fix the problem. So for now, at least we know that using drugs or anything like that for psychic reasons is not recommended. It turns out not to be a good idea. Now, if a person wants to do that and they happen to have fantastic rapport with a true master and they decide to go down that path, well, I have nothing to opine about that if they are really following the of a true master. Because it is true that Native Americans, for instance, did use a number of substances to their advantage, in a sense. It is true. So I can see how that could possibly work. But now when you go down to the corner, get whatever you've read on the internet that is good for you, that stuff is dangerous. But if you have a true master and you're following a strict system, which I do not do and I know nothing about, but if a person does know a true master and they are in that rapport with that guru or that master, I suppose it could be good. I prefer not to do that because I figure that if there were, I don't know, I figured that that's not my path. It's not a good idea for me. But for some people, I suppose it could be a good idea. To each his own. And I don't judge those who use it, but it's not the path that we follow. I think that there's a path that can be very healthy and very enjoyable. And that is a slower path, perhaps, but perhaps more sure. And that is the path of a natural development of your psychic abilities. And I think you can do that just by meditating a little bit every day, a few minutes every day. I think it's possible. I've done it, and other people have done it, and I think it is possible. And so that's what I encourage people. Anyway, that's the line that I follow. But that story that I told you is a completely real story. And it was a very sad story because this young man got really confused, Months later, months after the police showed up, he came back and he told me, yeah, this is what happened. They gave me this, and the other, and they promised me enlightenment by doing all of these things. And I began to see a snake inside of my body. And next thing you know, he was in the hospital, and he was very confused for a long time, So God only knows what substances they gave him, in what amounts, and last I saw of him, he was still very disturbed, So I don't know. I don't think that's a good idea. Anyone else want to say anything or ask any questions or comments? I see Crystal there. She's quiet, listening. Is everything awesome, Crystal?
Yeah, everything is fine. Just listening.
Have you had any more chocolate cake? Tell me the truth.
I had some 2 hours ago.
Did you really? How did I know, Crystal? That's awesome. Good for you. Really, really good. Yeah. That chocolate cake was good, right?
It was wonderful.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah, don't worry. On Sunday, we went to have breakfast there in downtown, and I don't know what happened, I got up to go to the restroom or something. I forgot what it was. I think I went to get some coffee at the countertop or something like that. And when I came back, there was this mega dessert that they brought to the table. I don't know who ordered it, but since it came to the table, we had to eat it. And Christina, of course, refused to eat it, because she's very health conscious. She refused to eat it. And of course, after I had a little taste of half of a spoonful of it, the rest of it disappeared. I don't know where it went because she refuses to eat it. But was it good, Christina?
That's what you always said. You always tell me that I eat it.
That's so funny. All right, guys. Mega, mega blessings to all of you. May God and the Ascended Masters rain mega blessings upon all of us. May your families be blessed. May your work be blessed. May your bodies be blessed. May your lives be a blessing to others. We'll continue tomorrow night, Misticismo Avanzado in Spanish. In the morning, of course, we have A Course in Miracles. God bless us all. God bless America. God bless this world, this earth. And I'll see you soon. Thank you so much. Good night.